Welcome, everyone. So we are happy to have you join the 12 in our series of conversation today. So there are about 87 participants registered, and the title of our presentation today is, let's see, the practice of encounter and solidarity in dismantling racism. And the presenters are Tom Mulloy and Kim Mazyck. So we're going to go over, I have a few housekeeping notes for our time today. So we can see each other. You are all muted. Only the co-hosts will be able to unmute. The chat box is the way to communicate with us. This includes questions for our guest speaker to be brought up after the breakout groups. You can also type in questions at any time during the presentation in the chat box. And then we suggest that you change your screen view to speaker view. If you're on a PC, that is on the top right. I'm not sure where it is if you are on a tablet or on a phone, but you can type in questions at any time. We want to notify you that this is being recorded and it will be available to view at a later date. Also, we talked about breakout rooms. You will see a box that states you have been assigned a breakout room. You will likely automatically go into a group, and if prompted, you will click join. If you have any problems during, if you have any problems, I would like you to use the chat box or email Maria Garcia. Her email is also in the chat box. At the end of this presentation and conversation, we will be receiving an email with a link to a short feedback form. If you would please take a few minutes to give us feedback about tonight's conversation. If you get disconnected by accident due to a poor connection, just go back to the registration email and click the link. You'll be able to join us again. So I want to thank you, and I hope you enjoy the conversation tonight. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers. So we're going to start with Thomas Mulloy. He's the Director of Government Relations for the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States, working with the Office of Justice and Ecology as a policy advocate. Previously, Tom has worked as Director of Poverty Programs for the National Council of the United States Society of St. Vincent de Paul, as well as for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops as a domestic policy advisor, focusing on economic, labor, housing, and social welfare policy. Tom holds a Master of Science in Social Administration from the Mendel School at Case Western Reserve University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in English and Spanish from John Carroll University. After graduating, Tom joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and worked in the Chairman Heights neighborhood of San Diego, California. Tom resides in Philadelphia with his family. The next presenter is Kimberly Mazyck. She's the Associate Director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. Kim has more than 2 decades of experience in community outreach and domestic and international advocacy. She previously served with the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, East-West Province as the Director of Outreach and Partnerships. She also served as Catholic Charity USA on the social policy team and at Catholic Relief Services. She's a graduate of the Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service with a degree in international relations and a certificate in African Studies. A warm welcome to Tom and Kim. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Gabby. So we are so honored to be here, but we wanted to start in prayer and also we want to just take a moment to offer a moment of silence for grief and for remembrance and for the repose of the soul of our slain brothers and sisters from Jacksonville. Angela Michelle Carr, who is the age of 52. Arnold Joseph Laguerre Jr., also known as AJ, was 29. And Gerald Deshawn Gallion was 19. Today we gather, it's August 28th. Many of you know that it's the 60th anniversary on the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. And it's an important day. That was a day that was really working on focusing to figure out ways to bring economic and racial justice to our country. And on the same day, we also had an act of violence that was racially motivated. So I thought that we start with a prayer by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today. The prayer is entitled, "Shake Us from Our Slumber." So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. When our eyes do not see the gravity of racial justice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes, O Lord.
When out of fear we are frozen into inaction, give us a spirit of bravery, O Lord.
When we try our best but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility, O Lord.
When the chaos of this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity, O Lord.
When it becomes easier to point fingers outwards, help us to examine our own hearts, O Lord.
God of truth, in your wisdom, enlighten us. God of hope, in your kindness, heal us. Creator of all people, in your generosity, guide us.
Racism breaks your heart. Break our hearts for what breaks yours, O Lord.
Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. We pray in faith.
Amen. So I wanted to start out by just talking about how this invitation came to, I will say to us, but I want everyone to understand. I was originally contacted by the team at the Archdiocese to do a workshop soon after I started my position at Georgetown. And in my first initial conversation with them, I said, I have an idea, but I don't know if you're open to that. And that is to invite my friend and colleague, Tom Mulloy. Tom and I have known each other for some time. We met when he was working at USCCB and I was at Catholic Relief Services. And we've presented more than once together. And as we talk about encounter and about dialogue and about solidarity, I think what we have learned as colleagues and as friends is we have to do this work together. Often I think when we have these conversations, people want to pivot to say, it's your problem, either speaking to people who are Black or African American, or pivot it back and throw it back to someone who says, no, it's somebody else's problem to figure out. And what we've learned is we know that this is work we have to do together. So in that vein, we will talk about our journey through talking about encounter, talking about dialogue, and talking about solidarity. So I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Tom.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, I would just add to Kim's comments by saying we ended up in the situation sort of serendipitously. We were at the Catholic Social Ministry gathering in 2020, and we had a professional relationship. We had some really candid conversations, and we were beginning to sort of build a deep trust that is needed to do this type of work. But I was supposed to moderate a conversation between Kim and another gentleman who at the last minute had to cancel, and it sort of thrust us into this space where we sort of had to come up with something on the fly, and we had to put together a presentation that didn't include one person. So from there, we sort of like blossomed this really beautiful relationship where we do this work together. And before we get going and join in, I want to say that this has been some of the most fulfilling, but some of the most challenging work that I've done in my professional career. Kim and I chose this title really intentionally and really after a lot of deliberation, because we felt that encounter and solidarity are obviously hallmarks of Catholic teaching. They're hallmarks of how we live faith. They're definitely hallmarks of the Pope Francis era. But lived encounter and lived solidarity as applied to anti-racist work as a white guy is extraordinarily difficult. And I've grappled with that, and I want to share that with everybody because I think that can be helpful as we do this work. One more comment before we begin. A lot of times over the course of this evening, I'm going to use the word we. I'm going to speak in the first person plural. Most of the time when I say the word we, I'm going to be speaking for I'm not going to be speaking for white people. I'm going to be speaking about white people. I'm going to be associating myself with other white people doing this work of dismantling racism. So I want to be clear about that, because I think the we is going to become important when we get down to what encounter means, what dialogue means, what practicing solidarity means. So I'm going to be speaking specifically from the perspective of white people. And so I think with that, we're going to move on to this first theme that we have in doing this work of encounter. I think a lot of times when we talk about encounter, it's obviously been as I said, a hallmark of the Pope Francis era. It's an ethic. It is a practice that imbues virtually everything he writes about, everything he does. Right? If you can remember back to some of the most compelling images from the beginning of his pontificate were embracing those folks at Mass. He wasn't up in the balcony. He was embracing folks at Mass. He was washing the feet of prisoners, female prisoners, female Muslim prisoners. So this deep commitment to encounter has been a hallmark. But what does that mean? I've always struggled with it a little bit, and because what does that mean? What does encounter mean to me when it comes to racist work and dismantling racism, right? Because if you are like me, a white working man, there are only so many hours in the day, and there are only so many hours in the weekend, and we don't, unless you're super intentional about it, there's not a lot of opportunity maybe to practice that encounter and to seek. You have to seek it out, right? And so as Kim and I began these conversations, it became clear to me that I don't have these conversations even in my professional life. They don't come to me. I have to go to them. And so the first point that we want to discuss about encounter is how do we seek out encounter rather than letting it come to us, or letting it be something organic or something that happens serendipitously, right? Oh, I thought you were going to jump in, Kim. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was. Well, that's what I was, but I wasn't sure you were going to say anything. But there's two things that I wanted to say is that Tom and I are very, I think, very intentional. And even as I was preparing for this, one of the things I thought about is that there's a lot that we can do in intentional. In my years at working at CRS, there's where I would lead delegations where I take people to different countries in Africa, and that feels very intentional. But that's also, I think, so large and so grand that it is this time in one place where we can be intentional in our own communities. And there are ways that we can seek it out, and ways that I also think, and this is it's a new thought. A thought that I had later this evening as I was reflecting on what I had written down, is that there's also some consequential encounters that we have. And those are equally important if we are empathetic within those opportunities, because encounter means that we are willing to overcome our fear to be with people, to welcome them, to know them, to acknowledge them. It also is that piece that we draw near to people so that we understand how people live. We have this quote up in front of you from Open Wide Our Hearts, and it's this one piece where it says, only by forging authentic relationships can we truly see each other. And I think that's so critical, because even in our consequential encounters, so that means you're in the store, you're walking in the street, and I know some of us live in suburbs, and so we may not walk down the street and encounter people and have to deal with whatever comes at us. I live in a city, so my experience on this is very different. But I also realize that those encounters that I'm not seeking for, and maybe some days I'm not ready for, and maybe some days I want to avoid, is also an opportunity where God is calling me to really break open, and I need to be authentic to them. And what does that look like? And so I think part of that is to really draw near, to understand how someone is living, even if that situation is nothing like mine, or when it is something like mine. And I think the part that I think about intentional encounter, and I say this as a woman of color, a woman who identifies as African American and Black, is part of my requirement in terms of encounter is the requirement to be honest and to listen, also to listen empathetically. But the reason I really want to, because I know this is a part of Tom and I back and forth in our conversations, is it is only when I'm honest that I'm sharing something that often people will maybe gasp, maybe shake their head in disbelief, have a hard time believing that it is something that has happened or occurred. And the reason that I think it's important for me to hold on to that requirement to be honest is, for many reasons, I may not want to be honest. It may be shame, it may be humiliation. It may be that I don't think that the person that I'm having a conversation with is really going to be listening empathetically and listening to what my experience is. But I'm also afraid that they're going to doubt me. And in that doubt, if I can't share what's really happened to me, and I'm talking about experiences that require me to be painfully honest, then I don't think that we break through to figure out, well, does that really happen? I think often when people hear, if it's not your own experience, sometimes when people hear about incidents of racism, it's real easy to be dismissive or maybe not think that it was hurtful or even harmful. And so part of that intentional relationship is to, on my part, be honest. And I think that has been what has been critical to the journey that I'm on with Tom, but the journey that I'm on with other people in my life. If I'm not critically and authentically honest to them, then I can't expect that our relationship or our experience will then enable them to see where there is inequity, see where there are problems, and then begin to think, what does that mean when we talk about solidarity?
And for my part, the other side of that is, as Kim said, listening. So much of it is just really authentically and deeply listening, but then believing. And this is this has been the really challenging part, is that my conversation, our friendship, Kim has shared with me a lot that, and other people, other Black people, when I've had candid conversations, have shared things with me that are literally unbelievable to me. And that's hard to at the beginning, that was just hard to accept, right? And to sit with. So one time, Kim and I were sitting at a bar having a couple drinks, and it had gotten a little bit late. The female, the bartender was a Black woman, and she sort of got wind of some of the back and forth that we were having, and she came over and she started sharing, and it ended up that the three of us were having a conversation. But I can remember this, and I'm not even sure if Kim remembers this, that I was saying, are you kidding me? That can't possibly be, no, that can't possibly be right. Because as a white guy, I've never had a medical professional not believe me when I've shared my pain or discomfort or my symptomatology, right? But Black women are just routinely not believed when they share their pain or some symptoms that they're sharing with their doctor. Serena Williams almost died when giving birth to her children, because her doctors didn't really believe her. They're like, yeah, she's not going through that. And so that was the first step for me in this journey, was listening, but also believing, and being open to really struggling with that and grappling with it, and figuring out, what do I do next? Because that's not easy. I think we can, as white people, we can hear a lot of stories and that can't possibly be the case. That can't possibly be true. And we all of a sudden end up in a defensive crouch, or our loved ones, right? We'll get to this earlier when we get to practicing solidarity. Our loved ones, our friends and family, if they get in a defensive crouch, that can't possibly be true. But I went to graduate school with a guy who talked about being followed by security every time he walked into a store. And I didn't believe that. I was like, that's possible. I come and go as I please. I think, that can't be the thing. But it was that was a long time ago. That was before I really learned to just sit with this and honor the fact that he shared that with me. And I think that's the last part, is just being able to honor that, honor the trust that goes into sharing that, and trying to figure out what to do with it, how to treat it with the value that it deserves.
And it's, usually when Tom and I talk, there are often new stories to share. The story I want to share today is an old story. And because I can do a show and tell. So I'm sitting in my office at Georgetown. This is a mug that is on my desk. It's a mug that I've had for years. But when I was working at Catholic Relief Services, and that is all I will say where I was working, I won't say who said this, I walked into the kitchen one day to make some tea. And I'm making my tea, and a colleague comes in and he sees my mug and he says, "Oh, are you an alumna of Georgetown?" And I said, "I am. For those of you who know me, I've always been it's even more pride now that I'm back here working, but I've always been a proud Georgetown graduate. I don't lead with it, but it's something that I'm very proud of." And so when he's asking me, I'm like, "Oh, what else is he going to ask me about school?" I'm ready to have the conversation. And then he says to me, which could be seen as a compliment, but it came from a place that I had not expected. He said, "Oh, did you get an athletic scholarship to Georgetown?" And I'm also prideful because I'm like, well, I wish I had been a basketball star or track star. But then it was a moment, and quite honestly, I was ready to dismiss it. I kind of laughed it off. I finished making my tea, and another colleague followed me back to my cubicle at Catholic Relief Services. He goes, "So why did he say that?" And I laughed, and I was like, "Well, he probably thinks." And the colleague said to me before I could get out of my mouth, he goes, "I don't think he thinks you were smart enough to get into Georgetown." And here's the thing. This is where I talk about the requirement to be honest. At that point, I am trying to laugh it off because that's the easiest thing to do. We're going to laugh about it. It's going to be funny, and I'll move away in my day. I'll move ahead in my day. But there is something some days where those things hit you in a different way. Like, does this mean he doesn't value me as a colleague? Does he not think I deserve to be in my position at Catholic Relief Services? Does he not think that I possess the intelligence to do that? And is that only because of how he sees me and how he sees me as a woman of color? And it's hurtful. And the reason I decided to share that story today is the same colleague who was with me recently came and had coffee with me at Georgetown and came into my office, and he saw the mug and he said, "Are you still carrying that mug around?" I go, "Well, here I don't have to worry about anybody saying anything. I'm not saying it won't happen here." But when I share that story, because some people are like, "Oh, Kim, I think he was just trying to say you're really athletic." And there's a part of me that wants to be like, yeah, because I am that competitive. I want to be seen like that. But there is something else when someone then questions, and because the litany then also began, "Well, what school did you go to?" And when I told him that I was in the School of Foreign Service, "Oh, I would have thought you were in the college," because it was much more competitive to get into the School of Foreign Service than into the College of Arts and Sciences. And I find myself just whittling down like, "Oh, I probably should have," I found myself kind of belittling everything that I think I had done to get into college, but it's interesting how it plays. And that's where I'm saying that requirement to be honest and to also be honest about where there's pain is critically important for this encounter to work as we move into dialogue.
For the record, I didn't even bother applying to Georgetown.
You're just being kind.
I did not. Nope. Nope. Georgetown was not on my list. So the last thing I want to say about encounter, I think before we go on, I want to put a really fine point on this, is that there's this sort of, for me, there's this inverse relationship between the amount of candor and honesty that can be shared and of trust and the size of the group that's sharing this. So I think the reason that Kim and I have developed such a strong bond and have been able to do this work together and be so honest is because so many of those conversations end up as one-on-ones. Maybe with one other person, but that sort of that small intimate encounter is what allows us to trust each other, which is what makes that true encounter possible. And so that's the last thing I wanted to say about that. But that it's hard, and I want to stress that it's I've had to seek out this relationship. I have to work on this relationship with Kim. It would be immensely easier for me to come and go and not have these conversations with Kim and not want to engage her in grappling with the really difficult issues. We'll get into some of those either as we talk about how our relationship has and the trust has matured and how that's helped me. But it's been only because we do that. We do it so closely and just the two of us.
Yeah, and people who know me won't be surprised. I always think about some things that Brian Stevenson always reminds us of, even as he's talking about dealing with race, dealing with incarceration. But he talks about being proximate, and that's part of having a relationship with somebody where you are actively engage with each other. And so I think proximate, a lot of people think that means sitting right next to each other, being in the same geographical communities, but it really means being close enough to have those conversations. And then the other part that he also often talks about is doing uncomfortable things. And even in the prayer that we offered, and is that, where you may say the wrong thing. I will honestly admit that we now have Tom and I have such great trust that I can say the wrong thing, and the humor and the candor is there. But if I say the wrong thing, we can have a conversation about how that is, that either that we understand what I meant, or, we can clean it up and apologize, but know that that is all authentic and it is all honest. And it's done out of a place where we really want to move ahead. We're not trying to be very focused on what was the thing that someone said wrong, that, you can sit there and sit on it. But how do you have this conversation? Much like the example I just provided, could I have gone back to my colleague and been honest with them about where that pain point was, and maybe inquiring what they meant? They probably would have said, oh, that's not what I meant, but it was how it was received and how others in the kitchen at the time received it, which is where the shame and the humiliation came from, because I was like, everybody heard that,
And I do say the wrong things.
I was taking it on for us.
I just want to affirm that, it's a great segue into, oops.
Yeah. Go back.
Dialogue. Whoops. There's into the next, that sort of like next stage of dismantling racism and our relationship, and that's dialogue. I call this my stepping on rakes phase, my stepping on rakes work, because it has at the beginning included a lot of stepping on rakes and being smacked in the face and making those errors and saying the wrong things and misspeaking and really stepping in it with Kim. But I can't. That's where the growth begins, right? Like the growth begins in the errors and in the misstatements and in the stepping on the rakes. But that's only a result of our trust, right? Of the trust that we developed during that stage of encounter. The quote you'll get a link to this, but Kim and I have been using this article for a long time, because it really encapsulates what goes on in this sort of phase of dialogue. So I'll just go ahead and read it. The confusing, perhaps contradictory advice on what white people should do probably feels maddening. To be told to step up, no, step back, read, no, listen, no, protest, don't protest, check on Black friends, leave us alone, ask for help, or do the work. It probably feels contradictory at times, and yet you'll figure it out. Black people have been similarly exhausted making the case for jobs, freedom, happiness, justice, equality, and the like. It's made us dizzy, but we've managed to find the means to walk straight. So if Kim, if you want to weigh in on this, if you want to weigh in first, or I can keep going.
Well, I'll just say, just to give people a little bit of context, and not that I know Trey, we just read the article that it will help provide a link to, but if you check the date on this, June 11th, 2020, so this is soon after George Floyd was murdered, and a lot of this was going on, and I felt a lot of this, like, it's tough, but some people checking on you that hadn't talked to you in literally years. I heard from some friends from college. I also realized it was at a time when a lot of us had more time on our hands than we were used to. But I do remember that someone called me at one point in time, and I was really like, I don't want to talk about it. Well, what do you mean you don't want to talk about it? You always want to talk about these. And I kind of was like, I need the pause button. And I can't make you feel better about it. And that was the point where kind of a little bit of a dam broke. Well, why don't you want to talk to me? And I was like, it's not you specifically, it's just anyone. And I just remember that period of time, kind of late May and through, through June, just being really exhausting, because there are sometimes that I was like, I can't talk about it. I can't talk about what happened to Mr. Floyd, but it's not like it's the first time something like this has happened. It's just everybody had an opportunity to see it and watch it in an inordinate number of times, because we were all home with our families looking at TV and trying to figure out what was going on in the world. And it's just so it still speaks to me, even though it was over 3 years ago. And yet it for me was the thing, because everybody's like, oh, should I be reading this book? Should I not be reading this book? And I'm like, I can't answer those questions for you.
Mm-hmm. And for me, the idea of this feeling maddening has always been what's resonating with me, because it was one of the primary challenges, and it honestly continues to be somewhat of like a stumbling block for me at times. But early on, trying to do this work of how do you get involved with dismantling racism and doing anti-racist work, especially in the church. Read this, don't read this, think about this, don't think about, like his encapsulation of how maddening it is. Step up, no step back, read, listen. It resonates with me, because it has felt like that times, like I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. And the idea that there isn't a thing to do, right, is kind of it's confounding and it's challenging, but it's also liberating, right? Because then it means that you get to seek out the what to do, and it's not just, oh, here we go, here's another Jacksonville, here's another Buffalo, let me pull out the to-do list of how to respond. Let me check in with these people, let me read these things. We have to do the harder work of figuring out what that is. And I think doing this for me, and I think the reason why I struggled with it in the beginning, and I continued, it continues to be an obstacle times to this day, is it means embracing a lot of vulnerability and a lot of sacrifice. It's not easy. It means like not having the answer and potentially being told you're wrong, potentially being told you just said something offensive, but having the courage to continue to do that work, knowing that might be the case, but I'm here, I want to do this work, and to keep going. Again, like transitions towards the sentiment that Trey shares at the end of the quote, and that is the persistence. You got to keep going, right? Unless you want this, unless this is going to be performative, unless it is box checking. Oh, well, I tried, but I didn't get an answer, and I got something else to do now. It has, if it's not going to be performative, it's going to be transformational. It has to be persistent. It's going to be a slog, but we do have to keep doing it. I'm gonna I want to talk a little bit about oh, Gabby, before I forget, I've been trying my level best to pay attention to the clock, but I haven't. So if we're going terribly over, please, and please let us know. Have you?
I'm watching the clock. That's why.
Oh, you are. Good. There you go.
I was shifting into dialogue.
What's that?
That's when I started shifting into dialogue. That's when I looked at the clock and I said, "Yeah, it's time to move us along."
Great. I'm stammering here because I want to get my words right. I'm a social worker by education. I'm a policy geek, so I am no theologian. But I want to share I want to share something at the risk of being being called an armchair theologian, because I found myself reflecting not too long ago on the parable of the rich man. Right, we've all heard this. The rich man asks how to inherit eternal life, and Jesus gives him an answer, and he says, "Yeah, I've done all that. I've done all of those things. What more do I have to do?" And Jesus says, "Give away all your possessions and follow me." And the man goes away sad because he had a lot of things. And so I found myself reflecting on this in the context of anti-racist work. And I think a lot of times we can say, "I've done all that. I've done all that. I've done what I've tried to do." Or I've done what I've thought I've needed to do. I've done what I thought I've needed to do. I've said what I thought I needed to say. What more? And the what more is why we stop, and it's why we walk away sad. It's because the what more is real risk. It's real sacrifice. It's saying the unpopular things in spaces where you could be looked at differently or askance. That I think that's a lot of what has stopped me at times. And trust me, unfortunately I am not proud to admit that I still pull my punches. There are still times when I'm in a space and I don't do it, and I don't take the risk, and I can't make that sacrifice, and I'm not proud of that. But there have been situations where I'm ready to take that risk. But I think that's what stops us a lot of times, and that is the what more is risky. It's risky, it's vulnerability, and it's sacrifice at times. And so as we move into the last portion of our conversation, I think that'll become clear. Like, how do we manage that? How do we manage that risk? How do we manage that vulnerability? How do we embrace it and actually do something with it?
And one of the things that I come back to again and again is it's a Pope Francis quote where he says, "It's impossible for peace to exist without dialogue. All the wars, all the strife, all the unresolved problems over which we clash are due to a lack of dialogue. When there's a problem, talk. This makes peace." I mean, when I mostly the time when I come back to it, I do make this, and that what sits in my head is I'm thinking of places like Ukraine, or places where we're seeing out and out conflict, and conflict that I've seen in my past, places like Rwanda. But when I think about how we look at racial injustice in this country, I think the biggest problem is that we don't talk about it. And I think, yes, the more we talk about it, I know there's some people who throw up their hands. They're like, "I don't want to hear it. I'm done." I've seen people get up and walk out of a room during a presentation because they're like, this is not where I'm at. They want solutions. They want very pat solutions, but they don't want to be involved in conversation. They don't want to have dialogue. And I think, hopefully we get to that point. I mean, I do think that I think it's a global problem, but I think it's a very specific problem to like the lower 48 states of our country, that we just have a hard time talking about how race relations are in our country, to the detriment of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So now we want to talk about the action steps, practicing solidarity.
This is I meant to add the Pope Francis quote here, so I'll have to read it. Or did I add it?
I don't think so. Right. Go ahead.
Oh wait, I passed it. That's what it was. I apologize. Here we are, practicing solidarity. So we started this conversation about the importance of deep encounter on an individual level, and the importance of my relationship with Kim to doing this work. But that has gotten me to this point, and that is this idea of, I've grappled with, Pope Francis puts a much better words to the concept that I've struggled with, is how do you transcend that how do you transcend proximity and geography? And at the very beginning of Fratelli Tutti, Francis says, he speaks of St. Francis of Assisi, and he said, Francis calls for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance, and declares blessed all those who love their brother and sister as much when he is far away from him as when he is with him. And he expressed the essence of the fraternal openness that allows us to acknowledge, appreciate, and love each person, regardless of physical proximity, regardless of where he or she was born or lives. And the reason why I've struggled with this is going back to my earlier comment, is that we commonly think of solidarity as proximity, standing alongside, standing with. It's a very proximal closeness thing. You're marching together, protesting together, standing in solidarity, right? And that type of solidarity is important and it's necessary. But I found myself I couldn't get around the fact that those opportunities in my life, and I think in a lot of people's lives, are few and far between, right? We don't get those opportunities to practice that type of solidarity, the proximate solidarity. And what does that mean? Does that mean that I can just continue to talk about the importance of solidarity? Or does it mean that I have to figure out how to practice solidarity absent those instances, those opportunities, right? I kind of, as I looked at some of the videos from earlier on in the session, I was sort of chagrined because two-thirds of the way through the first session, Deacon Art Miller, he stole my thunder. He says, if you remember, this was all the way back in 2020, so maybe some of you were here, maybe some of you weren't, but Deacon Art Miller gave a very profoundly challenging and deep opening session on racism, and he said, I think I'm quoting him now, so the we is not me, the we is Deacon Art Miller. He said, we need you to stand up when we're not there. Bearing witness means doing it when I'm not there, when he's not there. And that was it in a nutshell for me. Is like, that's how I've struggled with solidarity, is that how do I do that? That's really it's an amazing challenge, but it's a really difficult challenge. Like I said, I fall short. There have been times when I've done it, and there's been times when I fall short. But how do we do that? How do we practice that solidarity when the voice that needs to be in the room isn't in the room? Because I think I have two thoughts on that. And then the real challenge, which I think is probably, I don't know if Kim would agree with me, it's sort of the thorniest issue that I deal with in this work, and that Kim has been extraordinarily helpful with, that we'll get to in a moment. But in this search for solidarity that sort of transcends geography and proximity, I think two things. One, it has to be active, right? We can't wait for those opportunities to come around. We have to go out and look for opportunities to stand in solidarity with, whether it be in the workplace or within family. I'm going to go back earlier in this just dawned on me. It is Trey talks about it in his article. So I'm trying to find it because he talks about like well, I don't want to belabor this. Hopefully maybe I'll try to find it during the break. But he talks about we have to show up in our families and in our homes and in our jobs and in our civic associations and in our churches too, so those are the opportunities for practicing solidarity that we have to seek out. And then the other one is like solidarity needs to be reimagined. What does it mean for we, a white guy, to stand in solidarity with Black voices and Black people when they're not in the room? That is a really, really, really thorny issue. And so maybe Kim and I can get into how we've done that, how she's helped that, because this is the challenge in that I see in doing that work. Can I even do that? How do I stand in solidarity with Black voices that aren't in the room when they need to be there? Can I do it? It's really difficult because here's the thing. How do we honestly represent Black voices without tokenizing that voice, without speaking for it, feeling like, yeah, I'm going to tell all these white people what I know Black people think, right? That's not helpful. That's not helpful to doing this work either. That's not going to get people listening to me. So how do we thread that really delicate and really hard needle of standing in solidarity with and speaking up and sharing when it's appropriate and when I have permission to do so, sharing some of the stories and the pain that have been given to me in other circumstances, in a way that is authentic and helpful, and that doesn't come off as being holier than thou or really speaking for Black folk.
And what I want to offer, two things is, one is not words of my own. It's actually, I was listening to the speakers at the march, the 60th anniversary of the march. There was it wasn't a commemoration, it was a continuation of the work here in DC. And one speaker got up, he was, and I can't remember his name, but I was taken by his words. I jotted them down immediately. He was representing the Anti-Defamation League. And he said, neighbor is not a geographical concept. It's a moral concept. And then I was trying to figure out who said it. So I did a little, Google search. And then the full quote I found is, neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity are all bound up into how we are neighbors. And that being said, it is how do we speak for other people? And I don't think any of us ever want to. The one thing that I'm really, really proud about the work that we're doing here at Georgetown is whenever we sponsor a dialogue, it will never be usually it's for participants in a dialogue. They will never be for white men. And that means it's incumbent on the staff to look for women, to look for people of color, to have other voices brought to bear about whatever that issue is. That also means to say that when we are used to seeing panels on academic campuses reflect and look one particular way, ours don't look that way. So we might have a panel that's all women. We might have a panel that are all people who are African-American. We may have a panel where the only white person may be the person moderating the dialogue. But that is a new way to bring a voice. And lots of organizations have tried it, and people have said, well, because it can have the appearance and it can also have the feeling of tokenism if it's not done well. You can't just say, well, let's get this person. How do we also, our church is really profound on saying we need more young voices brought to the table, brought to bear. But how often do we invite the young voices to be the center voices? So even as we have these conversations about racial and economic justice if we're not having those with young people. And I don't mean the people that are 38 and 39. I mean, like, people in their 20s, people who are working for minimum wage, people who are not made, or if they are have an annual salary, it's still not livable wage. How do we talk to them about what economic justice looks like? How do we have conversations with people that are really struggling at work, whether it's within our church institutions or outside of our church institutions? But it's really important that we are committed, and this is where we have to be completely intentional, not consequential, that who are we inviting to the table, and that we do it with real intentionality, but also with real empathy, that we're inviting people in so that we give them a platform, if you will. So there is no tokenization. We're not, it's not just we want you to speak for a minute or two here to tell us what the experience of someone in this circumstance is. No, you are an active participant in this dialogue. And I think that beyond my work, all of how we all approach this in our parishes, who's on our parish council, who do we invite to sit on the different committees in our church? And if the makeup of our church is such that maybe those voices don't exist, then how do we partner with other Catholic parishes, or maybe even other denominations? Maybe there's an ecumenical conversation that brings our brothers and sisters across the Christian spectrum to have these conversations, so that we really do speak as community, right? And it's been done before. It is what's being modeled for us, and it's for us to pick up and to follow that path. If we don't do it, then we can't have the real hard conversations, because you can't build trust on saying, wow, there was a crisis, now we have to talk to each other. We have to build those relationships, and all the fundamental ways of how we build our own friendships when we go out for meals with people. I mean, this goes back to how Tom and I've developed this friendship that is trusting. It's, yes, I'm going to sit at the bar and have a drink with Tom. Yes, I'm going to have dinner with Tom. Yes, I'm going to talk to his family. Although I knew his family, or I knew his wife before I knew him. But how do we build trust is when we know each other, when we break down those walls so that proximate is what exists because we are comfortable with each other. It's in any relationship that if the more you build, and that breaking of bread, I mean, we can talk about what we do at Eucharist, but Jesus was always talking with people over food, right? And so how do we do that with our brothers and sisters so that we can have a true encounter that builds on dialogue, and that really is that fundamental concept and value of solidarity that is part of our foundational Catholic social teaching?
And I'll say this for my part, the trust that Kim's talking about sort of acts as a buoy for those instances when she's not around, and I need that. I don't know if it ever amounted, but I want to share a couple of examples of how our relationship was able to buoy me in some of those conversations. And I was sitting around with my not too long ago with my mom, and I can't remember, we were watching television, and I think it was a news story, and somebody on the television made a reference to the conversation, and my mom said, she just sort of mused out loud, I don't understand why Black parents need to have a conversation with their kids about the police. And I said, Mom, you've raised 3 white guys, big guys. We are nothing if not lovers of carbs. And I said, how many times did it ever occur to you to warn us about encounters with police officers, or what to do if we ever get stopped. And she said, oh, none. And that opened up an avenue for me to have a conversation with her about some of the stories that I've been told about that. And I've been able to just invoke the names of Philando Castile, and Tamir Rice. But I wouldn't have been able to do that without having the comfort and the foundation of our relationship. And that was really important. I don't know if it changed my mom's perspective, but I do know that it made me feel like I had taken that opportunity, and that I did what I could do in that moment. And the other time was, as I mentioned in Trey, in work. I think work is one of the places where we do have these opportunities to stand in solidarity with when Black voices aren't in the room. And I did have I don't want to sound like I'm gloating. What I'm trying to, or what I'm like, look at me. What I'm trying to do is say, like, while I still fall down and I am imperfect, I have had the opportunity to do this, because of Kim's relationship. And that is, we were this was years ago, in another job, we were looking at consultants, and we just wanted to hire a consultant, and it was down to two, a white woman and a Black woman. And I really, it was a difficult thing to say, but I really wanted to say, like, the resume of the Black consultant that we were looking at was much more accomplished. Numerous successes in getting grants and contracts. And I said, we really have to take another look at this. Like, we can't just go with this person because they were recommended by somebody else. And we ended up hiring that person, and she did a great job for us. But I don't think I never would have been able to speak up. I would have gone along to get along, if I hadn't been sort of buoyed with the courage to do something like that by Kim and my relationship. And I can say that I would have stayed silent, because unfortunately I have, and there have been times where I have stayed silent. And so there's just a couple examples of, like, what you can do to practice solidarity in very modest, maybe meaningful ways when those opportunities arise.
I'm watching the time, and I think we're probably at a break time, and we want to come back. We have some questions that we thought we'd offer for small groups, and then we want to still have time to be in conversation with everyone. So I think we'll move into break, and we might come back with a little bit of introduction and then move you guys into small groups. So we thought we'd just come back, and we have some questions for you, and we thought we'd go in small group and then come back. We'll come back to large group, either debriefing from the small groups, or if there are some burning questions that some people would like to ask us, we'd be happy to entertain those. So I think we're ready to send you off in small groups, unless there's another comment, Tom, you wanted to make. I'm just double checking with you. Oh, he's throwing up the questions, so we're ready. And I know that sometimes you can't even see the slides when you're in small group. I will also put the questions into chat for you guys as well. But the first question is, what are 2 ways that you can seek out authentic encounter? And the second question is, as you listen to us discuss the challenges we face in doing this work, what challenges do you see in your own life and or work? All right. And Tom and I will be in we won't be in the same group, but we'll be in small groups as well. But I know that we'll only be obvious in one group. So we look forward to hearing the conversation and following up with everybody in I think 15 or 20 minutes. And that I've lost the timeline. So this is one piece that Tom and I did not discuss, but how about we start here? Is there anything that anybody shared in their small group that they want to share with the large group before we just open it up to general Q&A? And feel free to put it in the chat or use the emojis to raise your hand. I love a silent, quiet room, even though it's a Zoom room. Everybody's quiet anyways because they're on mute. I can make a Beyonce joke, but I don't know if everybody's going to follow along, so I won't.
Let me double check. Maria, can people unmute themselves?
Or at least
they can.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So no reporting out, or do I call on groups? I can be that person. Well, so how about we start here? Were there some interesting ways where people thought that they could seek out encounter? I want to start there unless other questions come into the chat. Well, then go ahead. I was going to share a little bit about a story that I told you, Tom, that I didn't share.
I just wanted to share that my thanks for, I didn't get a chance to thank my group, but without breaking confidences or anything, that my group was very candid in talking about some of the experiences that they've had, and I just wanted to share my gratitude with them for trusting me with that.
So I'm seeing in the chat that somebody's saying that some people are saying that based on their life conditions, retired, etc., there's no opportunity to meet people of other races. I think that's where I think that that might be the intentionality that might be a little bit more difficult. I say this as someone who's on a college campus, which means I have so much consequential interaction right now. It's fabulous and yet challenging at the same time. But I do think that, and this is where I don't know, and you might, those who have offered these comments may have to say no more, is even as we go grocery shopping or we go to mass, or who are the people that it's one thing when you choose to meet friends or family for dinner. It's another thing where you may run into someone and not have any knowledge or backstory about them. How do you treat those encounters? Because I know that when I think about encounter, I'm thinking about what Tom and I have described. Is it something that grows over time, that is not just one moment? But I do think there's something to be said about how we do interact in those short-term situations, how we view people, how we see them, what backstory we may have based on our own bias, and how we may assign some of that bias to some people that we meet. How do we break that open so that our encounters can be more authentic, even with those people that are short term? So encouraging that. The one story I do want to share ever so slightly, and Tom knows about this person. I'm not going to use this person's name because I did not ask him if I could share his story. And generally I ask. My nieces and nephews know that they're fair game because I do ask, and some of them have stories that are really important to share. This is what I would call a play nephew. It's one of my dearest friends. We've been friends since I was 15. It's her oldest child, who I'm extremely close to. He's 22. He's tall. He's attractive. He's white. But we've hung out together since he was young. I used to take him to Georgetown basketball games before literally his weight could hold down the chair in the arena. And so he's known me his entire life, and he's known that his mom and I have been friends with her longer than she's been married, right? I remember going to a game one time, and I can't remember exactly how old he was. I'm sure he was like 7 or 8, and he always refers to me as Aunt Kim. And a group of boys who were all boys of color, mostly African American, but 2 Latino boys, were like, they kept looking at him and they kept looking at me and they kept looking at him. And now I'm thinking he must have been younger than 8 when I remember the interaction that happened. And they said, "Is that your real aunt?" And he looks at me and he looks at them. And it looks like he almost wanted to pinch me to see if I was real. No, it wasn't an imaginary friend. And he goes, yeah, she's real. But I realized he didn't know what the question that they were asking. The question they were asking is, was I his blood relation versus, the thing that I heard. But what I also learned about this sweet young man he's young, but he still seems like a young kid to me. But he when he used to go to Georgetown games with me, like, he knows Black people. He's educated enough to know what an HBCU is. He knows what historically Black colleges and universities are, but he's at a Georgetown game. He's with me at a Georgetown game. He sees the basketball team. And one day, somebody asked him about where Aunt Kim went to school. And he goes, "Oh, she went to the historically Black college." He's being all fresh with the information. She went to Georgetown. So he goes, "That's not an HBCU." And he goes, "Isn't it?" And he came home and he asked me the question. I'm using him as an example because his lived experience is such that he knows what his life and experience was with me, even though he has his experience with his parents, who are both people who identify as white. But he has different questions because I've been a part of his life. And I say that in terms of consequential because I don't think he has had any choice about me being in his life. He does now. We still do things together, and that's by choice. But when he was a kid, I don't think he felt like he had a whole lot of choice. But I also say that when I look at his current group of friends, his friends from his undergraduate years, he actually happened to go to the same school that this one did. He went to Case Western Reserve. When I went out to visit him at college, most of his friends were men of color. And I also think that's because he had a level of comfort that that's who he sought out as his friends when he went to college. So those were his choices. Those were intentional choices, even though his consequential choice of life is me. And I use all that as an example, is that we can live into the consequential people that are in our lives. There might be people that we don't have relationships, but how do we choose to build relationships with them? Even if it's the cashier at the supermarket. I think especially during time of COVID, those of us who would go out every 2 weeks, some of us I know had everything shipped in. I remember having a different relationship with those people because I knew that we were all living through something we had never lived through before. So how I checked in on them, how I asked about them, especially those people who were considered essential workers. I'm not sure people wanted to be working in a grocery store, but they may have not had any choice. How do I ask questions? How do I see them in ways that helps them feel seen, but also invites me to understand how their circumstances are different than my circumstances, right? So I just think that that's one way that we can begin to do those sorts of things. And now I'm seeing that as I'm chatting, lots of questions have come in. And so I know that, so once someone mentioned, I'm not reading names, but you guys can all see them. Communication gap and barrier maybe arise to cultural difference problem. I almost don't want to make assumptions. I'm leaning into Tom. I'm going to make him maybe consider that answer or addressing that question. I mean, I assume that and feel free to type into the chat, and I think people can unmute themselves, but I assume you're talking about the communication gap may also be, I know you're saying cultural difference. Are you saying language or just even diction? Even if both people are speaking English, if it's intergenerational, some people are using different words than other people are using. Tim,
if I can, that person was actually in our group, and I don't know, but maybe they're referencing the fact that I was discussing racism in the Hispanic Mexican community, and the way that people have your perception based on your appearance that you're not going to be understood. One experience we had, my wife is from Mexico, and we had gone to the store and people wouldn't assist because they figured we weren't going to be able to communicate. They just assumed that because it's clear that she's Mexican, that there was no way they were going to be able to help, so they would just walk away or pretend they didn't hear us. And so I don't know if that's where that's coming from because she was in our group, but that may be where it's from.
Right. And John, I think that's a real thing. I mean, I think that happens based on all sorts of cultural differences. Even I had an experience with, I was at a workshop in Louisiana. I'll never remember. It was an attorney who happened to be blind, had done a lot of work in the church and had done a lot of work to really bridge differences. And I found I was having a great time talking with him. He and I were sitting at the table. His dog that was assisting him was under the table, and somebody came to me and said, I have a question for him. Can you ask him? And what I realized is, some of us, again, I think fear controls this. I think we all live into it. Like, I don't know if this person had talked to many blind people before. And I admit that I was fortunate, unfortunate. I had an uncle who lost his eyesight. And so most of my years with my favorite uncle, he was the uncle that I spent the most time with, was blind. So I was used to describing things to a blind person. But when this person asked the question, I then remarked to them, I said, he can hear you. So he's already heard the question. But then they got really embarrassed. I saw them blush, and he then, rushed to kind of, not that he could see, I mean, he could just tell, you could just feel the tension, even if you couldn't see it. Right. And then he said, it's okay. It happens all the time, but I did hear your question and I'm happy to answer it. And he answered, but I do think it's the same thing. Sometimes people, I think there's a paralysis that I'm not sure how to respond. So I'm going to walk away and not respond. And I'm going to encourage people to, that's where that encounter is so critical. Like, even if you don't speak the same language, we can point to things, especially if you're in a store. Is this what you're looking for? And they can say, no, it's, they can, there are ways that we gesticulate when we're even both speaking English. And I have this all the time because nobody understands what I'm saying sometimes. But, we have to break down those walls so that we can communicate. Because I think the biggest fear is, if we're going to talk about anything, we're going to hurt somebody's feelings, we're going to offend somebody. And it goes back to Tom talking about stepping on rakes, that if we make those mistakes, that's when we can then make some progress. I mean, it's even one of the lines, and the reason I really wanted to pick the prayer that we picked is because even Dr. King was talking about making mistakes, that there's only way, we're humans, we're going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect. And we have to lean into that and know that we're going to do that. We're going to laugh at each other. We're going to laugh with each other, and we're going to build a better community by doing all that together. I see this. I'm also watching time, so I guess this might be the last question. But like 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. Is there a way that churches can create encounter and solidarity by intentionally inviting others to participate in a service in a meaningful way? Yes. I think earlier I said a little bit of something about ecumenical. I think sometimes we as Catholics may think, oh, I don't know if that group is over there, but we all know that there are other communities near our parish, right? Mm-hmm. There are ways to invite them. One thing that my parish does that I have love is we do a Thanksgiving service with 3 other congregations, and it shifts. So 1 year it'll be at St. Augustine's Catholic Church. The next year it'll be, believe it or not, the Lutheran Church nearby is Augustine or Lutheran Church. And then it'll be at the Baptist Church. So these 3 churches that are all within 3 blocks of each other, but in a triangle. So if you're going to get to one church, you can easily get to the other churches. I realize that may not be the case in most communities, and sometimes that's going to start with the pastor. So we who are the laity have to work with our leadership to say, how do we build a relationship with this other congregation? And maybe it's not a service, but I think a service is one way to start. But maybe, if you're doing a Christmas food drive, or if you're doing anything to assist the community in need, that you do it together. It's one way to, I think, build community. It's another way to address a need, but there's so much we can do together. And when we think about what Dr. King did 60 years ago, those were people across different faith traditions, right? And they were all coming together saying, we know that we can be a better country.
Yeah, and start with one invitation. Right. I think sometimes when we're doing this work, we're looking for these, like the outsized out, like the pound for pound, the biggest outcome for the smallest amount of work. Like, what am I going to, what task can I do? What thing that I get to do is going to have the biggest outcome? And sometimes it's just a series of smaller things. It's like invitation to one person or doing one thing over here. And and trust me, like I think because we're all like strapped for time, and we want our use of our time to be the most efficient as possible and be the most consequential as possible. But sometimes it's just one invitation to one person that sparks something. So start small.
So I'm noticing time because I'm trying to be good about that. And I realize we're at time. We are prepared to do closing prayer, and you're nodding, but I didn't know if you had a prayer. So should we go with prayer?
We wanted to do, we could do this in two ways. We have it as a few thank yous and then closing prayer, or do you want to do a closing prayer and then some closing whatever more remarks?
I feel like we should do it the way it's done in church, where we do the announcements before the
First.
before we
Okay.
send everybody forth.
All right. Miss Louise, are you on and able to do the thank yous?
I'm on.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, we'd like to thank the members of the ad hoc committee for planning and assisting with this webinar. I want to thank everyone for their enthusiastic participation tonight in our webinar, exposing how we work to heal racism in our church by exploring the connection between identity and welcome. Thank you for the Catholic Foundation for their support for these important conversations. Because of our generous funders, we will be able to carry on further webinars and dialogues on the topic of healing racism in our churches, our communities. Stay tuned for further information on webinars to come. I'd like to thank our presenters, Kim and Tom, for your time in preparing, praying, and challenging reflections for us. We appreciate what you've done to build the kingdom of God in our midst. We ask for your continuing prayers for us so we may walk forward, seeking racial healing and reconciliation. Finally, we want to thank Archbishop Wester for your leadership, for your vision, calling together the ad hoc committee on racism to respond to this important issue in our archdiocese. I ask everyone to watch for the follow-up email shortly. There will be a link for your feedback. We would love to hear from you. It's important that we hear from you. Our next webinar in this series will be Healing Racism Through Faith, and will be held September the 18th from 6 to 9 Mountain Standard Time. Stay tuned for the flyer on how to register. Have a good night, everyone.
So with that, we can thank you, Louise, and we can have our closing prayer and say good night.
Am I to do the closing prayer?
No, I think Kim and Tom have it.
Oh, good.
So thank you so much for this time together. I hope that Tom and our conversation provided some insight and some light in terms of all this good work ahead of us. So as we go out, we pray, and we'll probably do what we did before, which is just alternate so that we do this in partnership. Good and gracious God, who loves and delights in all people, we stand in awe before you, knowing that the spark of life within each person on earth is the spark of your divine life.
Differences among cultures and races are multicolored manifestations of your light.
May our hearts and minds be open to celebrate similarities and differences among our sisters and brothers.
We place our hopes for racial harmony in our committed action and in your presence in our neighbor.
May all people live in peace. Amen.
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 Amen.